Hello and welcome to another Polestar Pilates Hour. We're excited to be with you. Shelly and I noticed last week when we were talking about cueing the core, and we just got bombarded with thousands of more questions and realizing we have so much material to cover regarding this. Like it's a plethora of information out there, some of it good, some of it bad. Shelly certainly has been working hard this week, looking at many of your questions. So we're going to jump right in. Shelly, any thoughts on before we get started as far as the topic and just the enthusiasm and excitement that we received from?
The engagement, the engagement with this topic is huge and so many questions. And I feel like it opened up, like you said, we could probably do 3 or 4 hours right now and then do it 3 or 4 more times because there's so many different ways to look at this. We're, of course, mostly looking at it from a somatic, Pilates and Feldenkrais and gyrotonic and movements more like that. But, you could look at this from the weight training, which you're going to talk a little bit about, weight training, weightlifting. What about just, regular movement that we're doing, getting up and down out of our chairs in our daily life. And so I think that's one of the things that I want to have a little bit more clarity on and deliver a little bit more clarity on is we need to make sure that we're really asking the right questions, because it is definitely not one size fits all. So there's going to be an answer for this and maybe a slightly different answer for that. Sometimes it's the same. So I think it's fascinating. And so thank you to everybody who's written in with questions, and hi to everybody that I'm seeing put in their names who I know.
I was going to do a quick shout out to one of our educators, physios, senior therapist in Brazil joining us, Marla Coimbra. She is specializing in women's health. If you don't follow her, you're missing out. She is very active in Instagram. Beijos, Marla. I see that we have guests that have joined us from the Netherlands, Natalia, and Ohud from Saudi Arabia. So that's great to see. From London with Joseph.
Lots from London,
Yep. Martina from Germany. Great. And Estonia, we have joining us Marian. That's great. We have a good crew today. So we're expecting, we have a sort of a record number. We're like 1,400 or so people that signed up for today's webinar. So again, super excited to be with you today. And both Shelly and I are prepared, and we've done our research this week. We've got some articles, some research, but I want to start off with one Mentimeter slide, just one today, and take a shot at this question of ours. This was a slide that I had prepared in the core control lecture, and looking at Eyal Letterman's research out of England. And we'll be talking a lot about these things because we have to understand the science to support the art and the practice of cueing and teaching movement. Shelly, while we're waiting for them to answer, any thoughts on anything anybody said already in there that you want to do a shout out to personally?
Oh, I just have to open it back up. I had just closed it. I could probably say a personal shout out to just about everybody. I'm seeing people from Miami, I know, from the UK, from Germany. It's fun, from Greece, and then a bunch of people from the US. I just saw one of the young ladies, Laura, who was in our reformer course not too long ago. So I just think it's so fun that everybody joins and takes part in this. And it really, it's such a great thing that you've created, Brent, to really bring the conversations home to things that we really need to talk about. And sometimes we don't have the place to do that. And this really provides that opportunity to not only for you to bring in guests, but to do case studies, to do these types of discussions. Today, we're actually going to do a little bit of do along if you are in a space. So I think it's great. Thank you for that.
Yeah, super excited about that. There was a question just off the top from Sarah. Yeah, from Sarah Edwards. And the illustrations that we used last week are the illustrations from my book that's coming out, Principles of Movement, hopefully in the next 4 or 5 months. if we can, cut down enough trees, I guess.
Paper.
It
just needs to be an ebook, and then we don't have to worry about it.
And the illustrations are from Kelly Anderson. Kelly Anderson is a Pilates teacher and an illustrator. And she's not related to me, although I would certainly take her as a cousin. And then also my daughter, Alina Anderson, did a lot of the more abstract art pieces for the book, and a couple other illustrators. But the ones you saw were Kelly Anderson's illustrations. Hey, let's open it up and see what people say. All right. So this is a fantastic place to start, because the right answer, the correct answer scientifically, after doing a meta-analysis with hundreds and hundreds of studies of therapeutic exercise and core control, particularly for low back, Eyal Letterman came out very strongly saying that all of these are false. All of these statements are false. Now, how does that make you feel? Like, I know I was a little disturbed the first time I saw that document come through, and the latest research continues to support Eyal's finding and the idea behind this idea of core control exercises to prevent back pain.
It's interesting. I mean, I remember not necessarily this topic, but I remember hearing things from you, from Alistair, and from Juan. Those are my top three people who are my mythbusters. So you hear something you don't know, you kind of think, well, it could be true, I'm going to go with it. And then you hear somebody who's more educated and more with research and really looking at not just one piece of research, but when people are doing these meta-analyses and looking at large groups of people over long periods of time, you can start to realize that, man, that's not really true. And it's hard sometimes. I remember, low back pain and core strength, that has to go together. It must, and it just doesn't. It might. And I guess that's part of the discussion of the, causation and correlation. Just because two things are happening at the same time doesn't mean that they're related, and they might be and they might not. And we need to just be careful not to make those assumptions.
Yeah, and there were actually, to continue on that research, and there were a couple of questions. One was, what effectively improved or decreased low back pain? And the other one was, what actually was shown to cause low back pain? And some of the things that he had come up with, again, being careful of causative versus correlative results, was that there was a correlation between increased compression from core control, too much core control exercises, and disc pathology. And that it was considered in the summary of his paper, his meta-analysis, the summary was that all of these papers were actually finding that core control was disruptive to the neuromuscular patterning of healthy core organization. So what he's referring to in this, and I think it's important that we always dive deeper into the research. What he's referring to is that when we are doing isolated voluntary muscle contractions, and the two particular ones that we try to mimic come from the work of Paul Hodges and Carolyn Richardson, which we interpreted it incorrectly, is what I think we need to be careful of. What they discovered in the study was that people with low back pain did not have normal timing of the transverse abdominis. And the extrapolation in the practical world or the clinical world was, well, we better strengthen that transverse abdominis. So we're going to get a sphygmometer, put it under their back, and teach them how to hollow their abdominals or pull their navel to spine. And then you have the work of Stuart McGill, which was more, I just had a book here. Stuart McGill, a very famous author, thousands of papers, books out of Canada, that was basically looking at a powerlifting community and noticing that it was important that there was a sense of bracing to create stability with superload. So when you're lifting 400, 300 pounds, you really want to have this sense of bracing. Well, what both of them later acknowledged was that it was more about the intra-abdominal pressure that was required for the activity. And so the activity in Paul Hodges' study was lifting your arm up. That was the activity: flexion, abduction, and extension. And what they found was that the transverse abdominis at 30%, at submaximal, subconscious, contracted 50 milliseconds before the primary mover muscle. And that's what we need to take home. And that's what we need to talk about today is how do we now move into the art of cueing with understanding the science. And the science says that the nervous system is anticipating the load by the task we choose to do. So in that study, the task was lifting your arm up, and the body knew that it had lifted the arm up many times before, and it knew to have a successful lift of the arm, there had to be a subtle contraction of the TA 50 milliseconds before the deltoid. That's it. And so that's all we needed. So now if I'm a volleyball player or a tennis player, or I'm rock climbing and I need a lot more, stability or intra-abdominal pressure for that activity, those muscles to work and do their job, accelerating or decelerating, then we're going to see the grading load go up in the intra-abdominal pressure, which is going to result in more contraction, more recruitment, more endurance of these fibers.
I think I just went back and listened to the last webinar that you did with Pam, and I wanted to just hear what she was saying, because so much of this we relate to and talk about at the same time as pelvic floor function. And, I don't know how many times both you and she talked about spontaneity. And I know that's a big thing for us, that, sometimes there is, like you said, you as a therapist might do a little bit of volitional work or work to relax. Sometimes it's the muscles are holding too tight. So whatever the modality is to get that to at least the muscle to be able to lengthen and shorten appropriately. But then right away go into something that puts it into, again, that we talked last time about the system. So that it's the whole body, the mind, everything happening together with some amount of load that's appropriate, until the person has that awareness. And it again becomes not my volitional thought of this is how I'm going to do it. It becomes natural and we don't think about it. Yeah. And we just worked with, I got to be part of the movement farm last week, and to watch these kids who were 4 to about 11 years old, they were running, jumping, climbing, doing all these things. And they, not one time did we talk about engaging a muscle. No one was teaching them how to rope climb by, engage your biceps. When we take it out of that, like the central core stuff, and we put it to the bicep. Well, if you're teaching somebody to climb a rope, you're not going to say, okay, well, now you're going to use your deltoid, but you're also going to use your tricep to straighten your elbow. Now, bend your arm by, engaging your bicep muscle. It's just... It's
your lats. That serous anterior has to stabilize the scapula. Yeah.
Right? It sounds silly, but that's what we've done to the core. That's what we've done, like from our throat down to our pelvis. So.
Yeah. And I wanted both of us, Shelly and I, have some comments that we wanted to make off the last and then get immediately into some questions. One thing that I wanted to bring up is that the core, we talked about the core muscles last week. We went into the science and looked at the anatomy and sort of the neuromuscular aspect of it. But the core also includes the muscles that connect the extremities to the core. I mean, the idea when we talk about core control is the appropriate amount of stiffness for the anticipated movement, right? So a lot of times the load in our core comes through our extremities, almost always, unless you're putting a weight on your chest or something and you're wanting to move it around. But mostly the load comes from the extremities, the head, the arms, the legs. And we could definitely put into the category of core control muscles things like the hip extensors, the psoas muscle flexing the hip abductors, adductors, the pectoralis muscles, the latissimus muscle, all of these connectors, the serratus anterior, all of these muscles are related to controlling and contributing to core control. So I think that one thing we really want to get rid of is anybody thinking core control is the rectus abdominis. I think that's, to me, that's the scariest thing when somebody says, I did a hard core workout and all they really worked was their anterior pillar in their trunk. And then they might expand a little bit and say, well, I also do obliques. But remember we said that it's all the muscles all the way around the torso, in between the ribs, the long muscles that connect the extremities to the core, all related to core control. And we have to understand where we bastardize the word control, we want to bring that word back to life. We want to bring it back and really understand control is having the appropriate amount of stiffness for the anticipated load or activity. So it really comes back, and what Shelly and I have said for years is, well, that depends. What activity are you going to do? What do they want to do? You know, if they want to lift weights, we're going to look a little bit more like Stuart McGill's cueing. You know, we're going to do an engagement, a bracing to be able to, and there might be some breath holding or some controlled Valsalva to be able to get a max intra-abdominal pressure while you're doing a deadlift with 400 pounds. That's completely acceptable in the training.
Yeah, I think it's also important. We just talked about this as we were prepping, that we're not to have a double negative. We are cueing the core muscles. We are cueing the pelvic floor. We are cueing all the muscles. We're just not doing it by saying, oh, now contract your pelvic floor. Now contract your abdominals, hollow your belly, navel to spine. We're not using those ways to cue the muscles. And I think maybe that's where some of the misunderstanding is. We are absolutely 100% cueing the body. We are trying to think of it as a little bit more of a system. But there are things that I will do that will get certain muscle groups to maybe be a little bit more active. But it's not at the point of, again, not talking about or not cueing anything else or thinking only one muscle has a job here, because the more you can get the whole body to work as a system, the better you are when you leave class, right? For an hour, that was great. You did Pilates, but what happens when you go out and you have to run around a soccer field? And what happens if you have to do all these different things in daily life? You know, it's not that we're not cueing it. I think it's just, we're trying to do it in a little bit more intelligent fashion.
Yeah, we were talking also before we started, and most of you that know Polestar know the phrase, distribution of movement equals distribution of force. And Shelly put it into some very clear thoughts and words I'd like you to share with them as well, because I think this ties in to the idea of efficiency and how important mobility is.
Sure. It's the, I mean, and again, as Pilates teachers, we've all encountered this pretty much. I don't say all, but most have. Student in class, I can't do a roll up because I'm not strong enough. And you say, oh, okay, well, we'll get you stronger. And it's like, whoa, wait, you're perfectly strong. So this is my working model in my head. I've not verified this with anybody. There's been no research on it, but this is how it appears to me, that the way we were constructed, all the different joints, tendons, ligament, muscle, fascial connections, everything in our body was meant to function the way it was built to function, unless something really, significant happens, a significant surgery or something happens. We are built to move and also to be strong. So if all of us,
I was just going to interrupt. That was Eric Franklin's phrase, that we are built to move well, to function well.
Right. And now, though, life gets in the way. So we don't move as much as we could. We move too much in a certain way. All these different things of life happen. Now, a lot of those movement places, the joints, don't move enough. Some move too much. The muscles maybe aren't so conditioned. We haven't used them in all the different ranges of motion. So now, relatively, we are weak in comparison to how we were if everything moved well. And I use the example of, if you took a big, long board and you tied a string to the far end of it, and maybe it's, a 6-8 foot board, and you pull on this string and you try to pull the board up to be from lying flat on the ground to be vertical. You probably wouldn't have enough strength to do that, especially if it was a heavy wood, like a big piece of redwood. If you cut it into little sections and maybe, put a string through it so it's all connected, now it starts to look more like the wheel on some sort of heavy machinery, where it has that, it's all cut into these little pieces. Now I can pull with that same string, the first piece, the second piece, third, fourth, fifth, all the way through. And I can move that whole board. It still weighs the same. It's no different. But because there is articulation and movement, I'm only required to move a part of it at a time. And that's what's happening in our spines. If we had all the mobility, and both in the joints, but also in the soft tissue, I notice sometimes my bones and joints move okay, but sometimes I feel like just the tissue in my back just feels not very elastic, not very stretchy. So if all of that's working well, we are strong enough to move ourselves, we move enough. That's kind of how I think about it. So I think more about restoring elasticity and movement before strength, because you're already strong enough. Now, if I was going to do a roll up holding something really heavy, maybe I do need to condition my muscles a little bit more to take the added load. Just my own load of my own self, as long as we're active and move, we should be able to do that.
Yeah, and we see that all the time. The people that have suppleness of spine require very little effort to be able to move through space. And, even if we did increase the load, Shelly, the amount of torque they would need segment by segment would still be less than if their whole spine moved as 10 or 12 segments. Mm-hmm. And that's a very important point to make, because it ties into the question that Donnie's asking here as well. So Donnie's question is, to which purpose do we cue core? What's the purpose of cueing core? Well, we're cueing movement, right? So I think that's one thing we'll see over and over again. We go through the questions. We're cueing movement, and our goal is to go from a novice approach to movement to a more proficient level of movement. So whenever we learn something new, we're a novice and we're going to over-recruit. And we typically use strategies like co-contraction, over-recruitment, to try to understand the movement. And the easiest way to think of that is imagine learning to ride a bike for the first time. Very simple example, or if you've seen your children recently learn to ride a bike, they over-recruit and they stiffen everything up and they're shaking and they're all over the place. And within 2 weeks, they are much more efficient. The amount of torque they're using to move the bike through space is nominal. And then when they get older, want to be a competitive cyclist, now they're conditioning their body for endurance and load, endurance and power, the ability to go up hills, how to use it. Their goal still is always to be efficient movers. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's what we're cueing. Does that make sense? I mean, Shelly, you always tell me when I talk too technical.
No, I think that does. I just didn't want people to think, it totally makes sense. I just didn't want people to think that, we're just out there, blowing bubbles in the middle of class and not doing anything. I am indirectly cueing all the muscles of the body that are involved in the movement that I want. I'm just not, I'm not smart enough to know you need to engage this muscle before that muscle. This is concentric. This is more isometric. This is eccentric. I don't know those things.
Yeah.
So I can't be an effective cuer that way. So I have to cue an image. I also like to cue quality of movement, which I miss from a lot of teachers that I hear teaching. They're so caught up in the choreography, the counting, the breath, all these things that they're definitely important. But at a certain point, we have to go beyond that to look at the movement, So that's just one of my personal things.
I have noticed that over the years.
Once or twice.
It's interesting because, when we talk about cueing movement, cueing efficiency, moving in a motor control perspective or motor learning science, is we're going from a early state of trying to facilitate some kind of internal feedback through our external feedback, right? Because eventually the movement is about a task. The movement is about an outcome. And so if our movement, and this is what I always joke about in the gym, when I see the gym rats, is they got these incredible pecs and incredible cut abs, and they can barely move. And if I ask them to help me move furniture, I always say I'd rather have my pack of 6 strong Pilates practitioners come help me make a big move, than to have anybody out of the gym that they do not move efficiently, they don't lift efficiently. And this leads to something Shelly alluded to earlier, like talking about the hundreds, right? So to me, the hundreds is a classical example of really well integrated movement strategy. it requires a fair amount of strength to be able to hold the legs up against gravity. And yet it is endurance because we're holding it for a period of a minute or so. And on top of that, the emphasis of the exercise is breath. So we're breathing in for 5 counts, breathing out for 5 counts, and we keep repeating it. So what's happening is if you go after a hard, static core contraction of the rectus abdominis and the obliques to hold your legs up, that's fine for a few seconds. But as soon as you start breathing in diaphragmatically, what happens to your intra-abdominal pressure? What happens to your control? So the 100 is a very good teacher to us without us having to say anything of how to have an integrated systemic control to resist load while we are breathing. What a great exercise Joe came up with. The idea of breathing. Now, we could apply that to 100 activities, right? I'm working in construction. I'm working in I'm a mover for a moving company, right? Or I'm working in a warehouse and I'm carrying things that weigh 40 pounds. And I got to carry them from one end of the warehouse to the other end of the warehouse. Now robots do it. But let's say that I still did that like I used to in college. And I have to be able to carry that box, that load. My core has to have intra-abdominal pressure so my arms can function correctly to carry, and I have to breathe. So I've noticed people who have had injuries who hold their breath and can only carry the box or the load as long as they can hold their breath.
Right.
And the Pilates exercise says, hey, no. You got to maintain that load while you're breathing, and it has to be efficient. If you over-recruit, you can't breathe in. If you under-recruit, you can't hold your legs up.
Yep.
What a genius.
Perfect. And I just thought about this. I wonder how often Pilates teachers or movement teachers do and cue the same. I don't have a Mentimeter slide or anything, but I'm really curious. When you do your own exercises at home, you're not watching a video, you're not listening to anybody, you're doing your own movement for your own self. I wonder how many people actually say to themselves the exact things that they teach a class. I bet it isn't that way. I bet it isn't, because we couldn't do the exercises the way that people teach them. And if you've not tried this, I mean, you don't even have to be lying down, but try to do the 100 with the cueing that we often hear. And again, maybe everybody, I don't want to throw anybody under the bus. Maybe all 100 and how many people? 113 people, 14 people don't do this. But listen to people teach. All right, now we're going to go into the 100. I don't know how they set it up, but legs here, do this, curl up, really engage your abdominals. Okay, well, everybody listening, including Brent and Melissa, really engage your abdominals and now try to breathe. You can't, especially when you're in flexion. So this goes back to my comment from last week of we need to be, a little bit more, a little smarter, a little more intelligent in the way that we're delivering the information, and do your own classes, follow your own cues and see if it works. Because I bet it doesn't. And I bet when you move, it's really not probably the same as when you teach, because you think you're supposed to teach these things, yet as a mover, it's inefficient. Can I tell my short ballet story?
Yeah, I was just thinking I was going to ask you to tell the ballet story.
So, and if you've worked with me at all, you've probably heard me tell this story. But I had the chance to work with some dancers from the Dutch National Ballet when I was in Amsterdam, and we did a workshop. We did some things, and at the end, I said, are there any questions? And one of the women in the workshop was a principal dancer, a soloist for the Dutch National Ballet. I don't know if you've ever seen them, but it is an amazing company. And my first thought was, oh my gosh, I hope she doesn't ask me something that I can't answer. My second thought was, cool, I'm going to get to do this. So she says, every time I do a grand plie, which for those of you that don't know what a grand plie is, it's just a full squat. Every time I do a grand plie, my knee hurts. And this has been going on for my entire dance career. So I thought, oh, great. How do I know what kind of injury she has? Does she have an injury? I don't know. Da, da, da. And I had this little moment of Eric Franklin in my head, bone rhythms. Great. All right. Stand up. Let's see you do your demi-plie, a half squat. Let's do a full squat. Now, try this. Here's the thigh spiraling out. Here's maybe the pubic bones coming together. Went through the whole thing, and you could see the expression on her face. She did the first plie, and she had that moment of, I didn't have any knee pain. First thought was, yes. Second thought was, cool. We just fixed your problem. You had a strategy problem that you've had for, 30 years, and we just fixed it in 1 second. And so I went on. She, of course, we did it a bunch of ways so she could really reproduce it. And I said, so now how fantastic is, because she's teaching the younger kids in the ballet school, how fantastic is this that you guys can start to change how you're teaching the younger dancers so they don't develop these bad strategies and da-da-da-da. And she looked at me, she says, well, I can't do that. And I said, well, what do you mean? Do you need me to review it with you? She's like, no, that's not how you do it. And so she couldn't relate the thing that she had just done and had this huge epiphany. She had not, was not able to implement it yet. I know she probably did. This is not a comment on her. She was amazing, but it's just, again, how closely are we holding our beliefs, and can we change our beliefs for a better outcome? So yeah, that was fun for me. A little scary, but fun.
Yeah. I mean, I love that story because it's, and we got a couple of comments from Emily and Vanessa talking about the same thing, is that, the more that we can get somebody to experience and be aware of, and provide the internal feedback of how it feels to do a roll up correctly, then they're more likely to engage the proper neuromuscular fascial organization to be able to do that. And that is the ultimate outcome, is that they are able to perform proficiently whatever the task is that they want to perform. Our job is not to tell them what task, it's to, try to help them perform the task they want to perform. And that's whenever we do the case studies, that's what we're talking about. Hey, Shelly, let's jump right into some of these questions. And please keep your questions coming. We'll definitely pay attention to them. But we have hundreds of questions here in our spreadsheet that we can address some of these. So
all right, I'll let you can pick the first one.
Well, there was one about doing CrossFit in addition to Pilates. And it's common within the weightlifting world to brace on a heavy lift. And I sort of addressed this a little bit already. I'm still yet to truly understand why. Is it a classical case of we just do it because the previous people did it, aka the story Shelly just told, right? He said, I'm in Australia, and so I'll miss this. If you end up asking, thank you, and sorry in advance. So no apology needed, all good. But the question is, do we just do it because it's the way we've been taught? And that's typically the case. We are creatures of habit, and it's always hard when somebody introduces something that is a little different than the way we've always done it, or the way that we were taught to do it. And one of the things we take pride in Polestar is that we're always challenging ourselves to use the evidence-based research to help us better understand how do we achieve our ultimate goal, which is to help individuals participate in the activities they want to as efficiently as possible. So we talk about, this idea of impacting global well-being through impacting quality of movement, through education and practice. That's our vision statement. So if we're going to do that, we have to be able to evolve. It doesn't mean that anything we learned was bad or wrong. I think that's important to understand. All of the research out there shows that people who move, good quality, bad quality, people who move live longer and have better quality of life than people who do not move. So let's put that preface out there to basically say that, we never want to tell our client that was a bad movement. That was done so poorly, it's better you don't move. That would be a very false statement, right? Now, could they move better? Definitely. That's our job. Our job is to help them move more efficiently. Does efficiently mean that we're going to increase abdominal strength? It certainly might, depending on the activity. Is it going to increase mobility? It depends on the activity. If I'm doing powerlifting, I need mobility in things like ankles, thorax, shoulders, hips to be able to do it right. But I also need increased intra-abdominal pressure, right? I need stronger glutes, stronger abductors, stronger decelerators and the rotators of the hip. I need stronger shoulders to be able to tolerate the load. I need my bones to go through modification, adaptation to the load. And so all tissue in the body adapts to load. We help people have better quality of movement so that the load is more effective in the adaptation to the activities they want to participate, even including with bone density issues. I know there was a lot of interest a couple of weeks ago when you and Sherry were talking about some research in bone density and health of the aging population. This is with the message we want to drive. And so what we find interesting is that we get so stuck sometimes, and I'm just as guilty as anybody else. We get stuck in some beliefs, in some concepts that we've been taught that have been the way we teach. And even when we learn it, sometimes it's so hard to come out of our habits, to change our vocabulary, to change our cueing style, that it's easier to stay in the old way, and we revert back to our old ways.
Yeah. And I would say respectful. I've added that word. I used to tell my students, question everything. And then I thought, well, wait, hold on. Respectfully question everything, because your gut is really strong, right? Your gut feeling, right? We talk about that. It's not just about knowing things in your head. You have that instinct of like, this kind of sounds fishy. I'm not sure this is really right anymore. Or I've heard some things that, I'm starting to question now. So again, listening and, wanting to hear what the other person has to say, not going in to convince somebody of your own viewpoint, but ask questions. Why do we do bracing when we lift a heavy load? Why do we do such and such? Why might you do this? Ask the questions, because a lot of times that person may not know either. And it may spur them to think, I don't know that. Let's go find out. And, I think we have to do that a little bit more, be respectful, but, also know when it's like, I think there's something different. I'm going to go ask somebody else, maybe somebody who's more an expert in this field, or I'm going to look up some research. Remember, the research is, you could look at 100 different bits of research that all contradict one another. So, try to get themes and patterns of things. But, I think it's okay to ask. And it's okay to break some of these myths that we've been told.
Agreed. Talking about myths and sort of philosophies and ideas and concepts, there was somebody who asked about, can we go over the rule of ribs? And I think that the rule of ribs is very helpful in understanding core control as well. Like how do things integrate as we move through space, right? A lot of times when we look at the research for core control, we're looking at a neutral spine and a static position that is being held. And as much as we do that, that's not what we do in our normal daily life. We're moving around and we're very dynamic. So let's talk a little bit about rule of ribs real quick. So rule of ribs number 1 basically says that looking at the ribs themselves moving through space, that when the spine goes into extension, right, that the rib is going to move forward, and we're going to have like an accordion or a slinky effect opening up in the front of our body. There we go. Shelly, of course, has the slinky with her. So pay attention to Shelly as I talk. As we go into extension, we can see it. As you go into extension, and the movement's going to happen that the ribs basically are going to slide forward when the back or the vertebra is going into extension, and just the opposite when the spine goes into flexion, right? The ribs are going to slide posteriorly, right? And so it's a nice way of thinking of movement and cueing movement to get segmental concepts in there. The same thing's going to happen when we go into lateral flexion. We go into lateral flexion, right? We're closing down a little bit one area, we're shutting down, the facets are sliding down, but they're opening up on the other side, and the ribs are migrating towards the open side, right? And if you can think about it, it's not like I'm going to a max or an end of range. It's more going to having multiple segments sliding together to do that. So as we go into extension, the lower ribs are going to tilt down relative to the rib above. That makes sense. I'm going to extension, lower ribs tilt down. Well, that automatically facilitates a sense of connectivity of the rib cage to the pelvis. So if we want to go to the most basic aspect of core control, we're looking at connectivity, right? If we lose connectivity, then we hyperextend the low back and the whole rib cage comes up, right? And now we're in shear force, psoas is dominant, transverse abdominis and multifidi are shut off, and we're predisposed to wear and tear in our back. However, if you just try it with us, right? Let's try it together. We're sitting on the edge of our chairs, and as we go into extension, imagine that lower rib cage sort of reaching down as the sternum comes up. So it's like the accordion or the slinky opening up to the front. And notice how, just touch your abdominals. You weren't doing an abdominal contraction, but you'll notice that there's some tautness there. Now let's do the opposite now. So we're going to send the ribs back and up, all right, because the front ribs are going to close a little bit and the back ribs expand, and we go into a flexion. And you're going to go ahead and touch your abdominals again and notice, oh, my transverse abdominis is firing. I can feel it. It's not a max contraction at all. It's just working that way, right? And so that's sort of a way that we can keep it really simple without going into too much detail on the rule of ribs. But as we think of the vertebra and the rib moving, we're going to see this almost an opposition, where a lot of times what we end up doing is we want to go into flexion and we pull sternum down to pubic bone. We want to go into extension. We lift the xiphoid process up. So the movement never happens in the thoracic spine. It just happens in the lumbar spine. And therefore, there is no connectivity or nor core control in between the rib cage and the pelvis. And that's the basic of core control, is that connectivity.
And somebody asked about, I think it might have been a question from last week, or it was a question that we saw you last week and it came in this week, about improving observation skills. And that is something that is really, really important. And it's just a matter of putting in the time and seeing a lot of bodies. But I would say come up with a kind of a general, what do you want out of this movement? What's the general, the general gist of the movement? Is it more stability, more mobility? Where's the mobility? Where do people tend to move? If it's not in the right place, how can you make it better? So start coming up with those kinds of things. Also with the setup of the equipment, if you happen to be using equipment, what's the general setup of the equipment? It doesn't matter if it's a red spring or a blue spring. I've taught in so many different countries that don't have, they have equipment not only was not made, by a big manufacturer, it was made by some guy in his garage. Yeah. And that's all they have. And so there's no way to know what springs it is. It's not familiar, but if the spring is really heavy and supportive, if the spring setting should be really, really light, very tiny, somewhere in the middle. So get all of those things in place. And then watch people move and see, are you ticking those boxes? If you set the equipment up this way, does it improve? If you're watching, and this is one of my new, and again, if you guys have space that you can move, or you can even do it sitting in a chair, one of the most common movements that we do in just about any movement class ever is all the animals. So cat and horse, whatever, cat and camel, cow and whatever. But looking at spine flexion and spine extension. And what we typically do is, flex your spine and extend your spine. Okay, so those are the two places that already move in those directions. So instead of practicing something you can already do, round in your lower back and your pelvis, and then go back through your center position and round now or curve through your upper back. That is where you need to be moving from first. And I remember, Brent, you telling us this years and years ago about match the movement of one part to the other part. So we already have a thoracic curve. So if you want to go into more flexion, get the lower part of the spine to curve so it matches. You have a big, long, broad curve. And then if you need to do something like pull into a tight tuck, maybe you're a gymnast or you need to do something that pulls you in, then the whole spine will move together, and the same in extension. So I think that's, just some things you can work on is, where do you want the movement to occur? Or where do you want the more stability to occur? And are you actually seeing it? And if not, get it.
Yeah.
Tell people, give people that, because otherwise you're just lazy as a teacher, I think. Not always, but.
Hey, just a quick shout out for you guys. If you are enjoying or like the fact that we now have Shelly on with equipment, to see it, just a little shout out in the chat. We've got 3 questions that have come in on the Q&A. The first one is from Melissa. It says, is it efficient to exhale versus, with ha, the sound ha, versus any other sound to exhale? And there's another question that came in about breath, talked about in teacher training from Carolyn Halton. And I've heard cueing for exhalation on exertion. Do I agree with that? Deep engagement, the TA. So one of the things we often talk about, and you're never going to get a definitive answer from Shelly and myself that says it's always this way, because it just never is. The only thing that is constant is inconsistency, right? So the thing that we look at is we say breath is a tool, not a rule. So again, if you go back, and I know it's in the beginning of training, and we try to teach you that, look, we're trying to make things easier. So in this exercise, an exhalation is going to make it easier. And if it's a prolonged exhalation, if you do a pursed lip or a kind of thing sound, you'll have a longer lasting. Kathy Grant used to teach singing with her exercises. So everybody does a little bit of different thing. But the idea is ask yourself and see what you feel, rather than just saying, oh, everybody, ha is the most effective one. Well, ha could be the most effective sound for a movement and could be very beneficial to somebody, be able to really find that sort of deep understanding through voice, through vocalization. I love to have people sing from 1 to 8 in a tonal scale, going sort of like do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 as they roll up. And the pitch of it changing also is effective. It's not perfect, but these are tools that we use, not rules. When we want to challenge somebody because their activity, for example, a Cirque du Soleil performer up on the high ropes doesn't have a choice to inhale or exhale when they are, doing incredible feats of movement. So we have to challenge them. Hey, can you inhale there? Can you exhale there? The other thing we talk about in breathing is, do you have the capacity to breathe in all planes or diameters of the rib cage? Because there might be times where you're upside down holding on to a ribbon, 40 feet above ground in a Cirque du Soleil show. You might not, but somebody does that. And you're going to inhale with accessory motion, because that's the only place you can breathe. Everything's so engaged. And then you're lowering your body onto a plank. You still have to breathe. It's going to be a sip and puff game. And they're going to be glad that they practice hundreds, because maybe they get a little bit of breath out to the side of the lateral rib cage. So let's shift the thought. Is it best or not best? Is what facilitates the movement the best? What cueing facilitates the movement to be most efficient? Not the most recruitment, but the most efficient. Shelly, you seen some good shout outs there for you on the side, I hope?
I am. Thank you.
All
I
right.
just had a moment where I couldn't respond, so now I did.
There was David Johnson had a question. He says, so footwork, I hope I answered your question, Melissa. I think that, you can experiment with yourself and see what sounds and what directions of breath facilitate and which ones challenge, and then tie it into exactly what does that person want to be able to do. If we want them, if we know that they're very poor excursion laterally, then maybe we do a lot of exercises in the coronal plane to facilitate improvement in that displacement between the ribs and the coronal plane, or side bending, to get the breath strategy in that direction. And maybe they're really efficient in an anterior, but they're not so efficient in a posterior. So how do we facilitate that? Yeah. So David's question was, so footwork, and Shelly, I'm going to have you look at the next question you want off of the chart and bring that up. But David's question, so footwork on the reformer, neutral pelvis, neutral spine, or in pelvic posterior tilt, and reason for choice. Again, I've taught people who have severe hyperlordotic lumbar spine. I have to find a position that is relatively neutral for them in that moment. And so I might have somebody laying on their back doing a little bit of anterior, posterior tilting, some pelvic clock work, and then sort of finding something in the middle where they can create a little bit of stiffness before I start loading them with something like jumping or feet and straps or things like that, right? But the reality is that we move through all of those ranges of motion. So we move into deep flexion, we move into deep extension. I've heard people say that they have to stay in neutral, and it's like, well, you can't procreate, you can't play sports, you can't run, you can't do any of those things in absolute neutral. So function requires us to be able to move from neutral in all planes, usually in multi-planes at a time. So I was teaching this last week, Shelly, in USC, and one of the questions that came up from the student was the realization that we were doing the pelvic tilt very early in the class and doing the diagonal. So we were going to left foot to right shoulder. And they were like, I don't understand this movement. And it's like, well, that's walking. When we stand up, that's walking. And where are you not understanding it? Well, it just doesn't make sense to me. So, well, imagine that leg going behind you is the right leg's going in front of you. That's the anterior tilt to the left foot. And it was just a matter of connecting the imagery for them. And then they're like, oh my goodness. And then what they realized later at the end of the class was like, I've been walking without that motion for a long time, wondering why I always have sacroiliac pain and low back pain. Now, I didn't diagnose her, so I have no idea what the pain was, but those were her words of how, she needed to have that exposure and to understand that she was one of those that always thought of holding the pelvis neutral because of her back pain. So she was always over recruiting, and that would fall into IAL's statement, Letterman's statement of, you have that kind of compression all the time, it's going to be harmful to your movement strategy.
It also goes back to, it also goes back to Carol Davis is people know what they need. Our clients know what they need. We just need to give them a voice and a way to explain it to us. Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to jump in, but it was like, that's Carol. Yeah. I see a question, and a lot of this, we're gonna do a movement just with this question, because it does go back to how are we getting the body to be able to do the things we want them to do. We started with the 100. We talked about having a maximum contraction of the abdominals and how that makes it so that you can't sustain things. Several people asked about things like just femur arcs, and one of the things I'll ask everybody to be aware of, and if you've worked with me, you've done this before, but really think about your language of how you're describing the movement. So quite often when we're doing things like feet and straps on the reformer, one of the very first things I hear people talking about in feet and straps is, oh, and be really careful you don't let your legs go too low. And it makes me think like, well, what is the client thinking is going to happen? Like Godzilla is going to come out. Like, what's going to happen if I let my legs go too low? They never go on to explain it. And now I have a sense of fear about this movement. So I'm never going to let my legs go down any lower than this. And I'm probably going to keep my hip flexors quite switched on. I'm not going to have a lot of movement and length at my hip flexor because my legs will be too low, and I need to be afraid of that. Yet you see people come into class, they're lying down waiting for class to start. Their legs are pretty low, right? Granted, it's being held up by the table or by a mat, but again, think of what the language we're using really means to the client. How is it affecting their belief system? So when you're doing that, let's use some things that we can get the body to solve its own problems. One of my favorite leg arc is just putting some sort of cushion, ball, whatever, a little rolled up towel behind the knee and doing arcs this way. If you can do it now and you've never done this before, it changes the entire feeling, at least for me, around the front of my body. I don't have to tell anybody to relax anything or tighten anything. I'm just holding this ball behind my knee and doing this. And in this way, I'm creating now the scenario where the front of my leg, my quad and my hip flexors are not switched on. They're inhibited by using my hamstring a little bit. So that's one thing. In class, I have people push on their leg a little bit.
And especially in things like leg circles or anything that has a long lever, right? If you're going to get into the 100 and you're down here, right? How can you get your legs that low and still be able to breathe? If you cue the abdominals, again, that's not going to work. So we know that. So what I want to do is give the hip flexors the message of, hey, you know what? It's time to lengthen a little bit with control so that I can get to here. So I can use my hip extensors just a little bit to promote that. If you move during the 100, it's much easier, at least for me and for a lot of the people that I've worked with, to move while they're doing the 100 rather than have a static held position. Because again, we're promoting mobility instead of this fixed feeling. So things like that, try that the next time you're doing your hundreds and see if it helps you. If you guys have done any of the Runity work, that idea of having the hip extensors active, how active? I don't know. You know, I don't know, but I know that when I stand up, it's, you know, active here. Normally, if I bring my knee to my chest, my standing leg wants to bend. So can I start giving that information when I do my stretch at the beginning of class? Maybe, you know, a lot of people, oh, bring your knee to your chest. Activate this leg a little bit, right? So there's just some little tiny things you can start putting in to give people an idea. So when they approach it in a different way, in a different position, they've already kind of tried it on. They know, they're familiar with it. You still have to put it into functional setting, but at least there's something to kind of gravitate toward. They've experienced it before and you can relate back to that. So that's a couple of things that are kind of helpful just in getting the body to be more efficient. Yeah.
I want to continue on that note of the language. And there's some comments about language, and you know, you always have very eloquent language in your teaching. One of the questions in here was, why do so many people think their core doesn't work well?
Yes.
Why do people think they don't breathe well or their core doesn't work well?
I'll tell you my feeling on that is because we as movement teachers, gym teachers, personal trainers, whatever,
Therapists,
we've told them that.
Doctors.
We've told them that. Yeah. It's crazy.
Yeah. I love that when somebody comes to me and they say, I'm not a very good breather. And I'm like, well, you look like a good breather. And
Still
they're like, well,
alive.
what do you mean? It's like your skin has good color. You look relaxed. Let me feel your pulse. Yeah, you're very much alive. All the bad breathers I know are either dead or hypoxic. And, you don't look anything like them. Now, can you breathe more effectively and more efficiently with activity? Absolutely. So people would not be able to walk if they didn't have some degree of core control. There's no way we can maintain balance on a single leg as we're taking a step or going up stairs. If you've ever seen somebody who really has lost all their core control from a spinal cord injury, you understand very quickly that they don't have any core control. So telling somebody they have poor core control or they're bad core control is a really disservice to them. I think that we really have to be careful of the language we use, and also realize that, core control is not abdominal strength. Abdominal strength is a piece of core control, but as we said, it's really about efficiency of connecting rib cage to the pelvis and then torso to extremities to participate in the activities we choose. Yeah. And our goal is to be efficient.
And again, back to the awareness piece. And I know that we've been focusing a lot on returning the internal awareness to somebody, or giving them better internal awareness through our external cues that we give them. I think about, and I tell this to people I am working with, my people who do exams, and I know we're getting short on time. Next webinar has to be 2 hours, Brent.
I know. It goes too fast.
And, I say, like, what if your clients actually practice these things at home? They come and do your class, they do a private session, whatever, and they practice at home the rest of the days of the week. Would they have any idea what to do, how to do it, what that means for their body? I don't think we really teach with that in mind. So my clients, I hope I give practical things so that they can start to pay attention to. And alignment is one of those things. I go back to Juan. He, talks about this a lot, that there is a general good alignment. You don't want to have really bad alignment where we're doing really undue torque and wear and tear. There's also a range of good alignment. So as long as it's pretty good, let it go. It's not going to be perfect. Don't worry about that. Get people aware of what they're doing, how to do it, what is the goal, and how can they do it better. If that's the case, they're going to continue to notice, oh, my ribs were forward of my pelvis. My ribs are always connected to my pelvis. I have skin and muscle and all of this, my guts inside of me. But are they aligned where I want them to be aligned? Am I actually standing with my rib cage forward of my pelvis or back of my pelvis? Or is it relatively over my pelvis? How do I know when that is happening? How do I know when that's the case? I have to bring my awareness to it. So, again, instead of just counting, and that's one of my next new t-shirt things is, if you're counting, you're not teaching. If you're counting or leading choreography, and then I want you to do this, and then I want you to do that, you're not teaching. They could put on they might as well just go do it out in the park. So really give people information that they can take home and use later. And maybe that'll inspire them to do that.
That's awesome, Shelly. There was, I know we're out of time, and I still am looking at these questions. And I'm like, oh, I like that one too. I want to hit that one.
Well, we can maybe go over a couple of minutes, and people, if you have to sign off, you can get them in the replay.
Yeah. So there's one, just a couple of these that I think we've sort of put to rest. People that want, for example, a stronger core as their goal for Pilates, because Pilates has been deemed as a core control. I think you can totally say, absolutely. Pilates definitely will strengthen your core. There's no question as to whether it will strengthen their core or not. How you teach them and facilitate that core strength is what Shelly and I are talking about. So I think you're safe with that. Breath, there's another couple more questions about breath. I think we've sort of hammered that one. But remember, breath is a tool. So normal breath dynamics, anterior, posterior, lateral, superior, inferior. Learn and explore your breath with your movement, and notice when I breathe in this direction or I'm restricted in that direction. How do I make that happen? If you're doing mermaid, for example, and you decide to come over both sides into a rotation away from the Z-sit, and notice, where does breath go? Is it posterior? Your thoracic cage is in rotation and flexion now. Can you move that into extension and breathe into the front of the chest? And just start exploring how breath facilitates the movement and how movement can facilitate breath. Make it a tool. And you'll realize that when there is the increase in mobility, it's going to increase the ability to facilitate alignment. It's going to increase the facility or the ability to create power and torque where it's needed. It's going to increase the body to resist load when it needs to resist load, or when it has to transfer load. And that's really our purpose. I think, Juan's going to be my guest again very soon. And we're going to be talking about sort of extreme movement practices like Ido Portal and animal flow and parkour and things where they go and break all the rules of what people are taught as proper alignment. And what they're really doing, and we'll talk about this, is learning that distribution of movement equals distribution of force. If you have 12 segments in your spine that move in all planes, and you want to compare their stress load and their movement ability to somebody who moves from 2 segments, you're going to see drastic abilities improved in the person that has more mobility. And as Shelly said, you're going to need much less muscle torque to be able to do the same activities, and probably be a lot faster, have greater momentum and whip speed for certain sports and activities. And these are the kind of things we're diving into, and we want to continue talking to you about them. I think they're so important. I would love to get feedback from you about the successes and the challenges you're having of making the shift from the old school core control, navel to belly, get those abs super strong, pull them in, hold neutral, to one that is much more dynamic and organic, one that is really built around the task and the activities of our clients, and to let us know how it's going. What are some of the challenges? Because we can certainly help you. We've faced a lot of those challenges over the last 30 years, and we want to help you. We want to give you information. Shelly, any last thing you want to share?
The great thing you'll notice is that your clients will move better. They will notice they move better. They will express to you when you shift your cueing, you will know immediately, because they will start to notice as well. Their movement will be improved. I just had one more quick thing about, again, the muscle cueing and all of that with moving into extension. There's still kind of the old school, every time you go into a prone press up or a swan, you must cue the abdominals to protect the lower back. So that's, again, think of the language that we're using. What am I protecting my back from? But just remember, it's the old thing of like 3 out of 4 dentists, those people in the US, there was a gum commercial, you'll probably recognize that. 3 out of 4 dentists recommend this gum. Well, 3 out of 4 abdominal muscles help to produce flexion. So if you're just globally cueing the abdominal muscles when you're cueing extension, you're fighting yourself. So no wonder people are having horrible experiences with extension, because you're telling them to go into flexion and then move from whatever segment happens to move. So just, again, really pay attention to what you're saying. Question what you say. Do you do what you say? Can you make it clearer? Forget about perfect alignment and perfect performance. Let people move and then help them move better. And I think that if we can do that, we're good.
Thank you, Shelly. I think that's such great advice. And I think we've all been edified today, including myself, and I know Shelly has. And
me too.
Just for sort of forcing us to look at the questions and answer, go through and answer them, and be reminded of some of these things that, we've all been challenged with as far as teaching goes, and things the dogma we've been, taught over the years, and dogma that we've taught over the years and had to change. I mean, I think that's, if we can't be the example to you of change, then that's not a very good example, because we certainly have had to change our tune and our language. We really appreciate you. We couldn't do this without you, and we appreciate your enthusiasm. Please share with your friends. Know that we love sharing this information, and we've got a lot more. We just planned out the next 3 months or 4 months today, so we will have lots of good activities coming up on the Thursday Polestar Pilates Hour. We'll be sending you some links of special things coming up. We start all of our new series in the next month. So if any of you wanted to hop in last minute, we have some advanced courses. We have some online courses. Shelly teaches the transition and does a beautiful job of the intensive transition in multiple cities. So come join us. We look forward to seeing you next week on another Polestar Pilates Hour. And between then, be kind.